Hi, viewers. Welcome to episode 4 of Conversations Through Isaiah. I am joined again by Dr. Andrew Davies. Hi, Andrew.
Hello, Russ. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. It's good to see you again. Isn't it fascinating how every week we're wearing the same clothes?
We only have one top each, clearly.
I know. Anyone would think we're recording this all in one go on one day. So we have covered so far a fascinating introduction, which was quite lengthy, but we had to get to grips with who Isaiah was, what a prophet is, what was going on in his time, and all that kind of thing, and how the book flowed. And we dealt with that in the introduction, and you may want to pop back into that to revise. We then looked at Isaiah's view of guilt, very important in this book. And then last week we looked at God according to Isaiah, which could have gone on forever, but I found it fascinating, and Andrew managed to sort of navigate us through Isaiah's theology. And this week we are looking at the gospel according to Isaiah. I particularly use the word gospel. It means good news, and there is a whole thrust of Isaiah's message which is not just about judgment. It is about something else, of God's plan for humanity that is good news. There are 4 passages, Andrew, that when we're reading them, our minds can't but help jump into the New Testament, right? And they are chapter 7 of Isaiah. And we talked a bit about that in the introduction. That's the one which had the now situation for Isaiah was that there's a woman somewhere in a village in Judah going to conceive and bear a son, and she will call him Emmanuel. That's right?
That's right.
But it has a future use as well. And then there's another passage which we're going to talk to you viewers about at the end, Isaiah 53, and we'll maybe leave that for you to look into. But we're going to focus right now for a start in Isaiah chapter 9. What's going on in this chapter, Andrew? Before I read anything about it, what should we look out for?
Russ, Christmas has come early. Hooray, it's time for Christmas. So chapter 7 is about the announcement of the birth of the Messiah. Chapter 9 goes into a little bit more detail about that and explains who this Messiah is and what this Messiah is going to do. Okay.
So, shall I just jump in verse 1? It's always a good place to start.
Go for it.
Okay. And again, interrupt me, Andrew, if you think, whenever you want. Okay. But there will be no gloom for those who were in anguish. In fact, let me start earlier. I need to start earlier, don't I? I'm going to start in 8:21. Is there something intriguing about this, Andrew? Do you just want to tell us about it?
Yeah, so chapter 8 is one of the many bleak parts of the book of Isaiah. So it's one of the more complex parts of the book of Isaiah, which is quite difficult to interpret, which is why I didn't put it on the list of passages to talk about. But it's one of those that ends with a bit of darkness, a bit of misery, and a bit of punishment. So you've got this kind of verse 21 talking about the people passing through the land greatly distressed and hungry and enraged, and all they ever see is distress and darkness. So it's one of those many passages in the prophetic books that are a bit kind of doom and gloom and misery and distress and darkness kind of thing. So that's how chapter 8 ends. Yeah, so there are a few places where the numbering of the Hebrew Bible doesn't quite align with the English Bible. This is one. So chapter the first verse that Russ is going to read for us in a second, chapter 9 verse 1 in English, is the end of chapter 8. So this kind of first verse that we're going to read now is really the transition between the darkness of chapter 8 and the new optimism of chapter 9. It's the linchpin that connects the two, really.
Okay, so I'll start just a little bit before. At the end of chapter 8, they will pass through the land, greatly distressed and hungry. When they are hungry, they will be enraged and will curse their king and their gods. They will turn their faces upward, or they will look to the earth, but will see only distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they will be thrust into thick darkness. But there will be no gloom for those who were in anguish. In the former time, he brought into content the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he will make glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. You have multiplied the nation, you have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as people exult when dividing plunder. For the yoke of their burden and the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For all the boots of the trampling warriors, all the garments rolled in blood, shall be burned as fuel for the fire. For a child has been born for us, a son given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His authority shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom. He will establish and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time onward and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. It is Christmas.
It is Christmas. Could you hear like Handel's Messiah playing in the background in those first verses as you were?
Come on, I'll tell you, it's fantastic. It is interesting. I guess if viewers who aren't familiar with Isaiah and with this being lifted from Isaiah, and they only hear these kind of words at Christmas time when churches are putting on special events, they would assume it would be in an introduction to the New Testament or somewhere. But here it is. So, and what's it doing here?
It is, I mean, in a way, it is preparing the way for the New Testament in the literal sense of the New Covenant. This is sort of preparing the ground for a change in the way God deals with his people. It clearly has resonance in the life of Christ. It's clearly preparing the way for a game changer, if you like, on that kind of scale. But it also means something in the context in which it's originally written. So the first game changer in this is that the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. And that narrative that we've seen throughout the book of Isaiah of the darkness of sin, the consequences that go alongside Israel's rejection of God, those consequences are coming to an end. There is an opportunity for restoration, and that doesn't come for a few chapters yet. We see that unpacked a bit more in chapter 40, but this is the first real hint at that there is light coming, that the darkness is coming to an end, that God will remove the oppressor's yoke, that God will break the bondages that hold Israel in place, and that the land will be at peace again. You know, in the book of Judges, earlier in the Old Testament, there's this little phrase where a judge kind of solves a problem and kind of conquers the Philistines or the Amalekites or the Midianites or whatever. And it says there, and the land had peace for 40 years. And it's this wonderful representation of kind of all the dilemmas, all the battles, all the struggles, all the politics being sorted, and things were as they should be. What's really going on here is Isaiah's describing the land coming to eternal peace. It's not just peace for a generation, but all the boots of the tramping warriors and all the garments rolled in blood shall be burned. They'll never be needed again. There's a similar theme in Isaiah chapter 2, where there's the famous swords into plowshares saying, where God says, look, you won't need the implements of war anymore. There will be peace, there will be wholeness, there'll be restoration. And that peace comes from the birth of a child to whom all authority is given, the wonderful counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. Now, you might well say, those things could only be said of God. Certainly the mighty God. Who else can you say that of? That can only be God, especially given what we said last week about Isaiah's view of God being so strong and so distinctive. It could possibly mean that the person who has been born or has been acknowledged is a representation of God's presence on the earth. It could mean that, but certainly God's authority is vested in this person. In fact, what it probably meant in its original context was that a new king had been enthroned, quite probably King Hezekiah, who was one of the good kings of Israel, who represented God's presence in the world. A child has been born to us in the sense of a new king has ascended to the throne, which sounds a bit far-fetched, but that's kind of the language that was often used in the ancient world, or a rebirth, an enthronement that meant the same thing. And talking about his authority growing continually and there being endless peace for the throne of David is talking about the success of the nation of Judah in its original context. But actually, for centuries and fairly soon after this time, it was pretty much universally acknowledged that this wasn't just talking about the king of Judah at that particular time, but it was talking about an eternal king. When you start to think of authority growing continually, that means the bounds of your kingdom expanding. When you think of endless peace, this is not just for 40 years. This is a dynasty. This is a generation that will continue. And especially when the prophet says there, he'll establish and uphold the kingdom with justice and righteousness from this time onward and forevermore. That's quite significant. So Isaiah clearly has in mind not just, in this case, a physical situation on the ground in front of him. It's not just talking about the ascent of Hezekiah to the throne, because yes, that would produce a bit of light for a particular time. It would increase the joy of the nation. It would break the rod of the oppressor for a period of time. But Isaiah has in mind here justice and righteousness that will be established forevermore. And another little kind of twist of Hebrew that you might find quite interesting, that the Hebrew phrase for forevermore is la'olam, which means to infinity, not beyond, just to infinity. Okay, but it can also mean infinity of time and infinity of geography. So literally from this time onward, for an infinite period of time in an infinite bit of space is what this means, if you kind of push the alarm phrase to as far as it can be pushed, really. So what he's talking about here is a kingdom being established for all eternity, for all the universe, which will be focused on justice and righteousness, which will be a Davidic kingdom, which will be headed up by a wonderful counselor who is the mighty God, the everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. Why? Because God has determined to do this. So this is another brilliant example of the pebble being thrown into the pond, a meaning in its initial context, but actually a much greater and broader meaning that has great significance for us today. And when we read this as talking about the birth of Jesus, then there are some themes that come across really prominently to us. The joy, especially Christmas is in the middle of our in the middle of our winter. Darkness is an experience that we very often go through at Christmas. It gets dark early. The light in the midst of that darkness is obviously a kind of key theme that we often pick up on in Christmas sermons. But I think we often forget the significance of the broken yoke and the significance of the broken rod of the oppressor, the liberation, the freedom that the birth of Jesus means to the world and to Judea at the time of Christ is quite significant as well. So there are particular resonances for the early Christians in this passage and for us today as well. The message is that the birth of Jesus brings freedom for the individual, but also freedom for the world. The systematic structural freedom and liberty here, as well as individual freedom.
Yeah, it is interesting that, to go back to your analogy, which I think was a couple of episodes ago, of the stone in the pond and the ripples. When we read a prophecy like this, which we understand is as much forthtelling as foretelling, it seems more of a stretch to apply this to Hezekiah than it does to apply it to Jesus, which is not the way round you would think of it. And that's what, for me, it makes, this particular passage, beautiful but odd, that it clearly, for us with hindsight, seems to fit Jesus far more than it does a Hezekiah figure. What do you think?
Absolutely. And there are some categories of prophecy that do have in mind a more distant future, and the two that we're talking about today fall into that category. They do seem to envisage a messianic figure of some kind who is anointed for a particular task by God. Bear in mind that according to the book of Deuteronomy, you were only a true prophet if what you prophesied came to fulfillment. And so there has to have been some sense that the people who first read the book of Isaiah get some understanding that what he said happened. Yes, some of it could be talking about a distant future, in which case they'll give him a bit of rope and they'll say, well, yeah, of course, if he's talking about the distant future, that it hasn't yet been fulfilled. But they'd expect to have some contextual understanding of how what he was saying related to their context as well. It's more difficult for us a couple of thousand years later always to see the fullness of that. And we're so accustomed to kind of seeing Jesus in this, and quite rightly so, that sometimes seeing anything other than Jesus is difficult.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that's lovely. And can I ask what effect the close generations after Isaiah would have made on this? Would they have thought, okay, this was fulfilled in Hezekiah, this makes Isaiah a great prophet, he wasn't losing it, or would they have begun thinking already, oh yeah, this is clearly about Hezekiah, but it might also be about a future promised one? Would they have been thinking that quite soon after hearing it?
Quite possibly. So it's difficult to know for sure, obviously, but yes, it's quite possible. There are some interesting passages, especially in the last part of the book of Isaiah, which we haven't really had a chance to talk about very much in this little series at all. But the end of the book of Isaiah, the last 10 chapters, really envisages a much brighter future for Israel and talks about ultimate restoration and all the nations of the world coming to Israel to be blessed and to serve Israel. And that never really quite comes to fulfillment within the life of the prophet. So you sort of get this restoration and a renewal and a progress towards the fulfillment of those things. But the readers of Isaiah might have thought, well, hang on, we've never exactly seen the fullness of all that quite yet. I'm sure they would have been understanding of a sense of, well, yeah, partial fulfillment is where we're at, but there's still more. They'd certainly have experienced that in other areas. And it makes sense to think that they might see that here as well, that yes, Hezekiah does have divine authority on his shoulders. His ascent to the throne is an opportunity for light and for rejoicing and for happiness. He will, we pray, be a just and righteous king, and he did emerge to be a just and righteous king. But actually, there's a bigger call here for a continuing commitment to justice and righteousness, for the continuing growth and blessing of our nation, for a continuing call for God to be zealous to protect and defend and to bless us as well.
Yeah. But at some point, the hope of the future Messiah, a promised one described like that, embedded itself in Jewish culture. I assume. At what point would that have happened, really? Would that have been sort of an intertestamental period that would have happened?
So here's an interesting one. The Messiah is actually named and identified in the book of Isaiah. in chapter 45, where God says, I have chosen Cyrus, my anointed, a pagan king. So that's quite an interesting twist. The word Messiah simply means anointed one, so being anointed for a particular purpose. And Isaiah says, look, here's a pagan king, the king of Persia, that I've chosen to use as my tool. I've set apart Cyrus for my purpose and anointed him and empowered him and prepared the ground so that he can fulfill my work. So that's one of the earliest hints towards this kind of concept of Messiah as the one that God will use to bring deliverance. And again, of course, in another aspect that we haven't had a chance to unpack in this series, what are called the servant songs, the four poems about the servant of the Lord in the middle bit of Isaiah. The servant is very often called the anointed one as well. So Isaiah's concept of Messiah is a person that God has anointed and set apart for service, for a particular task and for a particular mission. Now, all of those different missions, the rescue of Israel, the redemption of Israel, the kind of drawing of all the nations, the gathering of all the nations back to Jerusalem, to the temple, all of those different missions culminate in the call of Christ and the mission of Christ to draw all the world, to reconcile all the world back into relationship with God. So those various messianic threads connect to Jesus, but it's quite interesting to think that there are quite a few of them in the book of Isaiah in different places.
Yeah, and probably Isaiah himself wouldn't have joined all those threads together and been able to imagine a figure like Jesus. Is that right? He would have a difficulty.
He would have difficulty, and even passages that to us seem so obviously to be about Jesus, it probably wouldn't have entered his head that they had any significance beyond their own community and their own context. Russ, I'm sure you and I have preached and said a throwaway sentence or a kind of short paragraph in the midst of those sermons that meant something to us, had significance to us, or sometimes almost didn't have significance to us. We almost didn't realize we were saying it. It certainly wasn't the core point of the sermon. And somebody comes up to us afterwards and says, when you said this, that really changed my view on life, or God really spoke to me through that one sentence. It's actually quite annoying, really, when you spent weeks preparing and then the kind of one throwaway sentence is what really speaks to them. But God has a wonderful way of picking stuff in his context, not in our context, and applying that more broadly to people's lives. I'm sure there's stuff that Isaiah wrote thinking, oh, this is what God's saying to me here, this is what this means to me. If he only knew the full significance of what he's writing, it would just blow his mind.
Sure.
So I'm looking forward to kind of having a chat with him one day and just discussing some of these issues and seeing A, if I was right, and B, if he fully understood.
Well, if anyone should be front of the queue, Andrew, it should be you.
I'm certainly hoping so.
Okay, let's move forward a couple of chapters if we can, because we have this other chapter which well, people will recognize lots of it in different contexts, but clearly it's another good news gospel chapter. Again, I'll read from verse 1. A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt around his waist, and faithfulness the belt around his loins. The wolf shall live with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hand on the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy on my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So pause there.
Yeah, it's quite a wonderful image, isn't it, really? I don't know if you had one of those children's Bibles when you were young that had like pictures of famous scenes from the Bible. And this was always a good one because kind of, I think the publishers of children's Bibles could always use the like Genesis pictures again and just improve them and take Adam and Eve out of it or put clothes on them or whatever. And this is like a reversion to the world that God had created. A world where all the animals are there, because all the animals, quick ecological point here, all the animals in every part of nature is representative of God's character. That's why caring for the earth, animal conservation, environmental conservation is a Christian task. It's a missional task because in his creation, God's character is revealed. So if we lose a particular species of animal, we lose a particular insight into who God is and what God's like. But yeah, all the animals that were created in Genesis are still here. They're not carnivorous anymore. The wolf shall live with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the kid. They're not killing each other anymore, which speaks into that kind of theme that's very prominent in Romans 8 again, that actually all of creation, because of humanity's sin, has been subjected to bondage. The world is the way it is, nature red in tooth and claw, because of sin. That wasn't the world that God designed. It isn't the world that we're going to see in eternity. And this is very definitely and very clearly envisaging a future world. This isn't Isaiah saying, oh, this will happen next week. He isn't saying kind of pull down the kind of walls in your farmyard. No. This is what the world will be like when it is ruled by justice, where equity is in place, where righteousness is the kind of key to all the decision making. So this is eschatological. And it is envisaging a future time, but it's a future time that kind of completes the loop and goes back to creation.
And overseen by this mysterious character who arrives from the stump of Jesse. Yeah, are we to link that with, chapter 7, chapter 9?
I think we can link it to chapter 6 as well. So I don't know if you can remember the injunction that God gives Isaiah, the message that he has to preach. He says then, go and keep preaching until there's nothing left, basically, until there's just the stump, because the holy stump is the seed. What's left after all the dross has been removed, to switch to a Deuteroisanic metaphor, what's left after all the wickedness has been done away with is something that I can start again with, God says. I am judging to purify, I am destroying to rebuild, and what I will rebuild will be a glorious kingdom that will be the way I always intended it to be. Not led by grumpy old men, not a patriarchal culture. I think it's quite significant that kind of a little child shall lead them. I think that's got obviously Christological significance in that it's clearly pointing forward to Jesus, but I think it's talking about getting rid of the wickedness of hierarchies that exist in society sometimes as well, which is quite an interesting thought. The injustices, the harmful aspects of life on our planet will be done away with. They'll not hurt or destroy, and God's presence and God's knowledge will fill the earth. I very much like as well the presentation of what this shoot looks like or this branch looks like. For starters, his wisdom and his kind of special abilities and special power come from the Spirit of the Lord resting on him. The Spirit of the Lord is quite prominent in the book of Isaiah, of course. We could look at chapter 61, for instance, which Jesus picks up on as indicative of his own ministry, the Spirit coming upon people, to empower them for service. This is a supreme example of that. His wisdom, understanding, counsel, might all come from the Spirit resting upon him and empowering him. And because the Spirit empowers him, verse 3, he shall not judge by what his eyes see or decide by what his ears hear. So this isn't just an emotive judgment, but a righteousness, a supernatural insight that empowers him to make decisions equitably for the meek of the earth. It's almost like a contradiction in terms, isn't it? Decide with equity for the meek of the earth. Right? Deciding with equity means deciding with equity. How can you decide with equity for somebody?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's bias. Deciding for somebody is bias.
Yes.
But equitable bias, a reversal of the structures of society that are so focused on sustaining our own power and continuing our own reputation and growing our own kingdom, developing our own agenda. The righteous judge that is emerging, that is coming to us in Jesus at Christmas, will decide equitably for those who need that equity and need that favor and need that blessing.
Okay. And this seems to me one of those passages that in no way, well, unless really stretching a metaphor and being so poetic, but in no way could the people of the day have thought this was anything but a foretelling. Is that right? There'd be no way this would be applicable there and then.
Yeah, I would say that kind of verse 6 onwards is clearly looking at a future glorious restoration. It's not talking about something they would experience now. I think you could take the earlier verses as kind of being prefigured at least. So what we want to see is somebody arising who's a figure of righteousness, who will be empowered by the Spirit. This is the ideal king that we want to see. We might not see him for many generations yet. We might not see him until the end of the age. But when we do see a king who is supremely empowered by the Spirit, who's supremely righteous, then the consequences that we will see then will be the wolf living with the lamb, the leopard lying down with the kid, etc., etc.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I'll carry on reading through to verse 16, because as I sort of takes a zoom out now and brings in other nations, so I'll read through it and let's see what we make of it. On that day, the root of Jesse shall stand as a signal to the peoples. The nations shall inquire of him, and his dwelling shall be glorious. On that day, the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnant that is left of his people from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Ethiopia, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the coastlands of the sea. He will raise a signal for the nations and will assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. The jealousy of Ephraim shall depart, the hostility of Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not be jealous of Judah, and Judah shall not be hostile towards Ephraim, but they shall swoop down on the backs of the Philistines in the west. Together they shall plunder the people of the east. They shall put forth their hand against Edom and Moab, and the Ammonites shall obey them. And the Lord will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt, and will wave his hand over the river with his scorching wind, and will split it into 7 channels, and make a way to cross on foot. So there shall be a highway from Assyria for the remnant that is left of his people, as there were for Israel when they came up from the land of Egypt. I mean, people may think there seems a lot of bad news if you happen to be in certain nations, not just good news. But we are reading a book which is very, Israel, 12 tribes focused. We have to understand that. Isaiah wouldn't have had a concept of Canada and America and Germany, the kind of concept we have now. But this is like a rallying call, isn't it? This future person, the stump from Jesse, is a rallying call to the nations.
Yeah, absolutely. And a means of uniting the peoples of the world. So the nations that are being opposed here are all nations historically that stood against Israel, whether in the wilderness wanderings before they came to the promised land or more recently. And the nations into which the people of Israel have been dispersed and expelled and exiled, all those nations God will send out and recover the remnant from amongst those generations, those locations. What I love about these verses, I think, is that you see the active inclusion of these people in the kingdom of God. God isn't saying here, well, if you just happen to be in Jerusalem at the right time, then you'll get all these blessings and these benefits. He's saying, if you're not in the right place at the right time, I'll send a signal for the nations and assemble the outcasts. This is a message of active inclusion, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, the opportunity of restoration is open here for you. And all those kind of tribal bitternesses and tribal rivalries, verse 13, the jealousy of Ephraim, the northern kingdom shall depart, they'll all be done away with. All those nations that have oppressed God's people before, that have stopped them from rising to the fulfillment of God's promise, all of those will be done away with. And there will be a highway from Assyria for God's people to return from there, just as there was at the Red Sea crossing, just as there was at the first Exodus. Once again, we talked about that kind of second Exodus theme cropping up in Isaiah. This is yet another reference to it, that God is bringing the people back to the place that they should be, because when they're in that place, it will be a place of blessing and of restoration that they can take out into the world. Not that all the blessing in the world is being centered here and kept here. All the blessing of God is being poured into this situation so it can flood out into the nations around.
Yeah. So, in Isaiah's mind, this was all about God redeeming his people, Israel people, bringing them back together. That's this kind of utopian vision here, that they might be a blessing to the nations, which is again is sort of an Abrahamic promise as well, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Is there a sense, do you think, that Isaiah saw this as himself as all very literal? I mean, I believe it's literal, a future earth being ruled over by King Jesus, and looking like this. Did Isaiah see it as literal, a wolf laying down with a lamb, do you think?
There are some hints that he did, for sure. Yeah. I mean, with all poetry, and most of the prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible are poetic, with all poetry, metaphor is very common. It's a way of communicating emotions and feelings rather than facts. That's just how poetry works. So it's always dangerous to push poetry too far. But yeah, there are lots of indications to suggest that what Isaiah is talking about here is a real historic circumstance that he's envisaging. There are parallel passages in chapter 64, for instance, and I think off the top of my head 62, where he talks about the kings of the other nations coming to serve Jerusalem, and the kings will tend your flocks, he says in one place, do your sheep farming for you. So it's clearly a reversal of the position of Israel being oppressed by all the nations that he envisages. It's clearly a reversal of judgment resulting in animosity between brother and sister nations and brother and sister people. It's a reversal of wickedness being the dominant factor around which society is organized, with righteousness being put right back at the center of the life. It's God being actively present in Israel and recognized by the world around that he is present in Israel. It's not Jerusalem being overlooked and God being forgotten about. It's the active presence of God in the world, in Jerusalem, in his temple, being recognized by all the different cultures and all the different societies around.
Okay. And I think people would recognize some of this language with sort of Revelation 24 4 as well, they will see that these two passages could be dealing with a similar thing. And I just have 2 questions to ask on that, Andrew. The first one is, my understanding is that this is our place. The earth is our place. God has given it to us and us to it, and our future is here. And one day his light and his glory will flood this place, and it will be heaven on earth. That's my dream. That's my hope. That's what I understand. Historically, I know, particularly other generations, and I guess many people, Christians around the world now, will think, oh no, this is a picture of heaven, another place, another place. What do you think about that? What's your understanding of that?
So I think eschatology, which is the kind of discipline of studying the kind of end of the age, the end times, is probably one of the most complex of all parts of Christian theology. There are parts of me that think of it as one of the least useful in some ways as well, if that doesn't sound a bit overly dismissive.
I agree.
I think there are some things that the Bible just isn't as clear as we might like it to be on. That's the long and short of it. We all would like to know precisely what happens when we die. And the Bible tells us some things very plainly. It says us, for me to live is Christ, to die is gain, absent from the body, present with the Lord, etc. There are indications that immediately at death, Christians transfer directly into the presence of God. But there isn't a single verse that says, this is exactly what happens, this is exactly how it'll work, this is exactly what it'll feel like, etc., etc. It'd be very nice if it did, but it doesn't. In terms of the details and the specific breakdown of what the new heavens and the new earth is going to look like, what heaven is compared to earth, how that's going to differ, again, the most insight we've got into that is in the book of Revelation, which is a particular subset of prophecy. It's something called apocalyptic, which is a special kind of prophecy which needs decoding even more than any normal kind of prophecy. I think it's actually quite dangerous to sit this side of it and say, this is absolutely what it means. And whereas I'm sure if we did a series of interpreting Revelation, the answers kind of determined, that would sell like hotcakes. Everybody wants to know what's going to happen. It feels like we've lived through something of an apocalypse this year, doesn't it? So sure. Is there anything worse to come? We ask ourselves. We'd all like to know for sure. The Bible just doesn't tell us all of those kind of things. And I think that's deliberate. I think God sometimes has to say to us, look, just kind of keep your focus on the things that affect your life day by day. Leave me to sort out the bigger picture. But there are just some intriguing hints, sometimes using metaphor, sometimes using poetry. So we get a better sense of the values that the new heaven and the new earth will be lived by, and that will be prominent there. We get more insight into those things than we do the detail of everyday life there, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. Very wise. I think it's fair, I mean, just to finish, Andrew, and to widen our horizons, it's fair to say that the gospel according to Isaiah, the good news according to Isaiah, is not about the souls of individuals being saved by God. It is broader and wider and more universal than that. Can you maybe in a nutshell tell us, well, maybe not just Isaiah, but maybe we can finish off with just the thrust of Scripture, of where the trajectory is for the good news. What is the good news for planet Earth? And we've had some clues in Isaiah. Are you able to talk to us just a little bit about that?
Let me give it a go. So Isaiah is a great book to explore those ideas through, really. Yes, there is a very clear message that individuals need to be brought back into relationship with God, that individuals need a change of heart. quite a few of the Hebrew prophets have that kind of theme. So the being given a new heart theme, for instance, actually comes from Jeremiah. That's kind of one of the most famous passages of that book. But yes, absolutely, there is talk of individuals putting their faith in God, individuals trusting God. But the story of salvation is somehow rather greater than that. It's not just about me as an individual. It's about God's plan for human history being focused on restoring all of humanity. It's about God's plan for the world involving a return to the state in which he created it. God didn't just create the Garden of Eden to be something for us to desert. He created the Garden of Eden to be a place in which we can live in relationship with him and walk and talk with him in the afternoon sunshine as Adam and Eve did. And Isaiah definitely has us on that trajectory. Yes, all the kind of secular nations recognizing the special place of Israel, coming to God's temple to give praise to him and to learn from him. There's still lots of education and lots of wisdom being imparted in this context. But fundamentally, it's about the quest for relationship, that God, who created the heavens and the earth, who is the Lord of the heavens and the earth, longs to engage with and communicate with and live with the people that he's created. And he can only do that if they will wash their hands and cleanse their hearts and come forgiven and redeemed to him and submit to his plan and purpose.
Brilliant. And may we join him in that quest too, I think, for that kind of relationship again. And whether we like to imagine what the future may look like and where it may be. Let's just be satisfied to leave that in God's hands, I think. But I love the fact that people like you and I, Andrew, we are more than just being on a quest for the salvation of our own souls and our own well-being. We are joining in with God on the redemption and recovery and healing of his creation, humans included. And we know he will have the ultimate say in that and how that happens and what that looks like. But for now, we are satisfied to give our all to joining in that quest. I love that. I love the fact that we are part of a bigger thing, bigger than a local church, bigger than acts of corporate praise, bigger than the Cadbury Centre for the public understanding of religion. There is something cosmic that God has invited us to be a part of. And viewers, if you are believers, you are a part of that, and we invite you to get stuck in. If you're viewing this and you're not, you're just intrigued by the scripture, then I urge you, get in touch with a local church, give them a call, Google them on a website, find out where they are, ask them some questions, and be a part of God, what God wants to do in this world. Andrew, that's been brilliant. Thank you. And we do have a bit of homework for the viewers, don't we? We want them to dip into an important chapter and maybe find something in it. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, we do. So we set ourselves a very big task in 4 weeks trying to cover the book of Isaiah, 66 chapters, an awful lot that we've not been able to talk about. And one of the most famous chapters in the whole book for Christians is Isaiah 53. So actually, Isaiah 53 begins at Isaiah 52:13. It's the fourth of the servant songs that I just mentioned briefly. It's talking about the suffering servant. So what we want to ask you to do for homework, to get extra credit for this class, if you like, is to just read through Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12. Read it through carefully, just reflect on it. Think about what it's saying. Imagine its context in the life of Isaiah the prophet originally. What's he talking about in his original context? But also acknowledge the ripple in the pond, if you like, that has fulfillment in the life and ministry of Jesus. Just reflect carefully on the words. Sometimes we read this through assuming that it's only ever talking about Jesus. and forgetting that some of the other things that are going on in the background. So read it attentively, enjoy it, and be reminded of just how enormous the sacrifice that Jesus has made for us is.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. And if anyone is viewing and you're feeling a bit out of sorts at the moment or down, let me encourage you, do what Andrew suggested earlier on. Chapters 40 to 55. Go on, read them in one sitting. And he dared us to come out of that not feeling uplifted. So there we go. 15 chapters to change your world around. Andrew, bless you. Thank you so much.
It's my very great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining me on the conversation. And we'll catch up again soon. Bless you. Thanks, viewers.